He stood 6 feet 9 inches tall, weighed over 300 pounds, and possessed an IQ of 145, bordering on genius. His name was Ed Kemper, a veritable giant of a man. But the danger he posed was not in his towering height or his formidable intellect. The true terror lay in what he could become. At first glance, he was the man no one noticed quiet, shy, almost gentle, with a soft-spoken demeanor that put people at ease. But behind this placid facade, a universe of darkness churned. This was a mind that, at the tender age of 15, could argue with his grandmother one moment and shoot her dead the next. This was a man who could be declared cured by the very system designed to treat him, only to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. He would cruise the sun-drenched highways of 1970s California, offering rides to hopeful young women, and in the confines of his car, transform into their worst nightmare. He would end his spree not in a hail of police gunfire, but with a calm, methodical phone call in which he, a meticulous historian of his own atrocities, confessed to it all. This is the story of one of history's most terrifying minds, the man they called the co-ed killer, Edmund Emil Kemper. We invite you to step into the chillingly articulate and brutally violent world of a monster who understood himself better than anyone, and it made him all the more horrifying. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California, into a world that seemed, from the outside, to be the picture of post-war American optimism. But inside the Kemper household, the air was thick with a silent, corrosive poison. From birth, Ed was an outlier. He was an unusually large baby, and he grew at an astonishing rate, his body quickly outstripping those of his peers, marking him as physically different. His mind was just as exceptional. His IQ, later measured at a staggering 145, placed him in the genius category. He was a bright, articulate child who could grasp complex concepts with ease. But this combination of a giant's body and a genius's mind was housed within a fragile emotional vessel, one that was about to be systematically broken by the person who should have been his greatest protector, his mother, Clarnell Strandberg Kemper. Clarnell was a woman consumed by her own bitterness and frustrations. A heavy drinker with a sharp, cruel tongue, she held a deep-seated resentment towards Ed's father, and by extension, towards Ed himself, who she saw as a physical embodiment of the man she had come to despise. When his parents' marriage finally shattered, Clarnell took custody of Ed and his 2 sisters, and the household transformed into her personal fiefdom of emotional tyranny. Her cruelty was not random. It was precise and targeted, and its primary target was her only son. She relentlessly belittled him, mocked his size, and attacked his developing masculinity. "You're a real weirdo," she would sneer. Her most cutting and prophetic words were reserved for his future with women. "The girls will laugh when they see you. You'll never have a girlfriend. No woman will ever love you." For a young boy grappling with the awkwardness of adolescence, these words were not just insults. They were a curse, a prophecy of rejection that he would internalize and, later, tragically fulfill. The abuse was not merely verbal. Clarnell, obsessed with the idea that her giant son might harm his 2 younger sisters, banished him from the main house. His bedroom became the basement. It was a dark, damp, rat-infested space he called the hole, a literal and metaphorical dungeon where he was locked away each night. He was isolated, treated not as a son, but as a dangerous creature, to be contained. But instead of breaking him in the way she might have expected, this isolation became his crucible. In the cold, lonely darkness of the basement, Ed Kemper's inner world began to take shape. He retreated into elaborate, violent fantasies. The rage he felt towards his mother, an anger he dared not express, was channeled inward and began to fester. He started to kill the family cats burying one alive and later digging it up to decapitate it and display its head on a spike. When he was just 10, his dark fascinations turned towards his own kind. He would play a game with one of his sisters called Gas Chamber, convincing her to sit in a chair while he pretended to pull a switch, imagining her death. His mind became a laboratory for thoughts of death and violation. His childhood was not one of scraped knees and bicycle rides. It was one of morbid rituals and a burgeoning, silent hatred, with his mother always at its epicenter. One day, one of his sisters asked him a simple, innocent question. "Ed, why don't you kiss a teacher?" His reply, delivered with a chilling calmness that belied his age, was a terrifying window into his fractured psyche. "Because I'd have to kill her first." He had already begun to fuse the concepts of affection and violence, intimacy and death. The only way he could conceive of being close to a woman was through an act of ultimate, violent control. By 1964, the situation at home had become untenable. At 15, Ed was now a towering figure, physically intimidating even to his domineering mother. Unable to control him any longer, Clarnell first tried to send him to his father, who promptly rejected him, wanting nothing to do with the son he barely knew. As a last resort, Ed was shipped off to live with his paternal grandparents on their remote ranch in North Fork, California. For Ed, this was the ultimate act of rejection, a confirmation that he was unwanted by everyone. His grandmother, much like his mother, was a strict and overbearing woman, and the idyllic ranch quickly became another prison. The simmering rage that had been cultivated in his mother's basement was about to boil over. One morning, after a heated argument with his grandmother over his use of a rifle, something inside him finally snapped. He took the .22 caliber rifle he had been allowed to use for hunting, calmly walked into the kitchen, and shot his grandmother 3 times, killing her instantly. He then waited. When his grandfather returned home from the grocery store, a short time later, Ed met him at the door. He later claimed he didn't want his grandfather to see his wife's body. He shot him once in the head, killing him as well. He did not panic. He did not try to hide the bodies. With the same unnerving calm he would exhibit for the rest of his life, he called his mother. After telling her what he had done, she instructed him to call the police. He did so, and when they arrived, he confessed to everything, calmly and methodically. On that day, in the quiet foothills of California, the fantasies of the boy in the basement had become a brutal reality. The world had just been introduced to Ed Kemper, the killer, and there was no turning back. Given his age and the nature of the crime, the California legal system deemed Edmund Kemper a mentally ill juvenile delinquent rather than a cold-blooded murderer. Instead of being sent to a state prison, he was committed to a Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security psychiatric facility for the criminally insane. This institution, filled with some of the state's most disturbed and violent individuals, would become Ed Kemper's university. He arrived as a 15-year-old double murderer, a towering, awkward boy with a genius IQ and a soul steeped in rage. He would leave as a master manipulator, a man who had learned to perform sanity so perfectly that he could fool the very experts tasked with analyzing him. At Atascadero, Kemper quickly realized that his intellect was his greatest weapon. He observed. He listened and he learned. He saw other inmates, less intelligent than himself, try to feign remorse or fabricate stories, only to be seen through by the hospital's staff of psychiatrists and psychologists. Ed chose a different path. He decided to become the perfect patient. He was polite, cooperative, and seemingly introspective. He devoured books on psychology, learning the jargon, the theories, and the diagnostic criteria of the men who were studying him. He began to understand what they were looking for: signs of remorse, an understanding of his actions, and a commitment to change. and he decided to give it to them. He took every psychological test thrown at him, but not before discussing the questions and the correct answers with other inmates. He learned to craft his responses to fit the profile of a rehabilitated young man who had been the victim of a tragic upbringing, but was now on the road to recovery. His high IQ allowed him to be incredibly convincing. He could articulate his supposed feelings of guilt with a sincerity that was utterly believable. His performance was so flawless, so compelling, that the hospital staff began to see him as a model of successful treatment. They were so impressed with his intelligence and his apparent insight that they gave him a job as an assistant, helping to administer and score psychological tests for other inmates. The irony was profound and terrifying. A burgeoning serial killer was now an active participant in the psychiatric evaluation of other mentally ill patients. He had infiltrated the system from the inside, learning its weaknesses and exploiting its assumptions. Behind this mask of the repentant, intelligent young man, the dark fantasies continued to churn. He was biding his time, playing the long game. He knew that his release depended on his ability to convince the review board that he was no longer a threat to society. He became a master of the therapeutic narrative, telling his doctors exactly what they wanted to hear. He spoke of his domineering mother and overbearing grandmother, casting himself as the victim whose repressed anger had tragically exploded. He expressed deep regret for the murders, framing them as an aberration, a youthful mistake he now fully understood and had moved beyond. Finally, in December 1969, on his 21st birthday, the system rendered its verdict against the recommendations of some of the hospital's own psychiatrists who harbored lingering doubts. The review board declared Edmund Kemper cured. They believed their methods had worked, that this brilliant young man had been successfully rehabilitated. He was released from Atascadero and paroled back into the world. A man who had murdered his own grandparents and who still harbored a deep, pathological hatred for women was now free. The system, so confident in its ability to diagnose and heal, had been completely and utterly deceived. Upon his release, Kemper tried for a time to live a normal life. He harbored a strange ambition to become a police officer, perhaps drawn to the authority and power of the uniform, or perhaps as a way to be close to the world of law enforcement he so strangely admired. He applied to several police forces but was repeatedly rejected, partly due to his criminal record, but primarily because of his intimidating physical size. Frustrated and aimless, he drifted through a series of menial jobs. And then, in a decision that would set the stage for his next, more horrific chapter, he moved back in with his mother, Chlorinal, who was now living in Santa Cruz. It was as if the universe was determined to replay the first act of his tragedy. He was back under the roof of the woman who had locked him in the basement, the source of his original trauma. But this time, he was not a powerless 15-year-old boy. He was a 6'9" 300-pound adult, a man who had killed before and had learned to hide the monster inside behind a veneer of quiet intelligence. The rage that had been dormant for years began to stir again, now deeper and more patient. He bought a yellow Ford Galaxy, a car that would become his mobile hunting ground, and began to cruise the streets and highways of Santa Cruz, a city teeming with the very type of young, independent women his mother had taught him to despise. The perfect patient was now an invisible predator waiting for his moment. The Santa Cruz of the early 1970s was a vibrant, countercultural hub, a place where the ideals of the hippie movement still lingered in the sea salt air. It was a university town, home to the sprawling University of California, Santa Cruz campus, and was filled with young, idealistic students. Hitchhiking was not just a means of transportation. It was part of the culture, an act of communal trust. It was into this world of unsuspecting innocence that Ed Kemper, the cured patient, began his hunt. His physical appearance, which had been a source of lifelong ridicule, now became his most effective tool. He was a giant, but a soft-spoken, seemingly gentle one. He appeared harmless, even a little oafish, and certainly not threatening. This, combined with his high intelligence and articulate manner of speaking, made him an expert at gaining a person's trust in a short amount of time. His killing spree began in May 1972. His method was chillingly consistent. He would cruise the roads around the university campuses, looking for young female hitchhikers. He would pull over, offer them a ride with a polite smile, and they, seeing no apparent danger, would get in. Inside the car, he would engage them in intelligent, often charming conversation. He would talk about his life, his studies, anything to put them at ease. Then, once they were on a remote road, the mask would drop. He would drive them to a secluded area, and there, in the confines of his car, he would unleash the violence he had fantasized about for years. His preferred method was strangulation, an act of intimate, personal power. But the horror did not end with their deaths. For Kemper, the murder was only the beginning. He would take the bodies back to his apartment, the same apartment he shared with his mother, and engage in acts of necrophilia and dismemberment. The killing was an act of control. The post-mortem rituals were an expression of his deep-seated, twisted rage. His first victims were 18-year-old Mary Ann Pess and Anita Lucchesa, two Fresno State University students who were hitchhiking to Stanford University. He picked them up, killed them separately, and brought their bodies back to his mother's apartment. He dismembered them in the bathtub, a grotesque act of butchery performed while his mother slept just a few rooms away. He then dumped their remains in remote parts of the Santa Cruz Mountains. Months later, in September 1972, his next victim was 15-year-old Aiko Ku. She was a dancer on her way to a class. Kemper picked her up, charmed her with conversation, and then drove her to a secluded spot and strangled her. He took her body home and kept it in a closet overnight. The next morning, with his mother out of the house, he decapitated her and engaged in further horrific acts. The chilling duality of his existence was now in full swing. He could eat dinner with his mother, engage in polite conversation, and then retreat to his room to commit unspeakable atrocities with the body parts of his victims, all without her suspecting a thing. The spree continued into 1973. In January, he murdered 23-year-old Cindy Shaw. After killing her, he brought her body home and hid it in the basement, the very same hole where his mother had once imprisoned him. The symbolism was not lost on him. It was a place of his own personal horror, and he was now populating it with the victims of his rage. His final two hitchhiker victims were 20-year-old Rosalind Thorpe and 23-year-old Alice Liu, both university students. On February 5, 1973, he picked them up together. This time, he used a gun to threaten them before killing them both. Throughout this horrifying period, Kemper was developing a bizarre relationship with the local police. He would frequent a bar, popular with Santa Cruz police officers, buying them drinks and engaging them in conversation about their cases. They came to know him as Big Ed, the friendly giant who was fascinated with police work. They had no idea they were sharing beers with the very serial killer they were hunting. For Ed, these murders were a rehearsal. Each victim was a surrogate for the one person his rage was truly aimed at, his mother, Clarnell. He would talk to the severed heads of his victims, sometimes screaming at them, venting the years of hatred he felt for his mother. Other times, he would speak to them tenderly, a twisted pantomime of the affection he had never received. He was an artist of horror, his medium the bodies of the innocent, and he was preparing for his masterpiece. The darkness that had been cultivated in the basement was now ready to return to its source. It was time to go home. The time had come for Edmund Kemper's lifelong narrative of rage to reach its horrifying, inevitable climax. Living under the same roof as his mother, even while his killing spree was at its peak, was a constant, simmering torment. Clarnell Strandberg, oblivious to the fact that her son was the notorious co-ed killer terrorizing the community, continued to treat him with the same casual cruelty and contempt she always had. She belittled his inability to find a real job, mocked his social life, and reminded him of his failures. Every word she spoke was a fresh log on the pyre of his suppressed fury, a fury that had now been honed and perfected through the murder of 6 young women. The surrogates were no longer enough. The rage needed to find its true target. The night of April 20th, 1973, arrived. It was Good Friday. Ed and his mother had been arguing. Later that evening, he went to a local bar. When he returned, his mother was in her bedroom, reading a book. She looked up at him and said, with her typical dismissive tone, "I suppose you're going to want to sit up and talk with me all night now." Ed simply replied, "No, good night," and left her room. These would be their last words. The rage had reached its breaking point. In the dead of night, around 4 a.m., Ed re-entered his mother's bedroom. She was asleep. He was holding a claw hammer. He stood over her for a moment, and then, with all the force of a lifetime of hatred, he struck her on the head. After bludgeoning her, he took a knife and cut her throat. The years of emotional abuse, the nights in the basement, the endless stream of humiliation, it all poured out in that final, bloody act. But it wasn't over. In a series of grotesque acts that lay bare the full depth of his pathology, he decapitated her. He later told investigators that he then placed her head on the mantelpiece and screamed at it for hours, venting all the things he could never say to her when she was alive. He used her head as a dartboard, and in a final symbolic act of silencing her, removed her larynx and forced it down the garbage disposal. It seemed appropriate, he would later calmly explain. His mission complete, his mind now shifted to a cold, practical problem: how to cover his tracks. He knew his mother's friends would soon wonder where she was. He called her closest friend, a 59-year-old woman named Sarah Sally Hallett, and, in a calm voice, invited her over for tea. When the unsuspecting woman arrived, he strangled her to death. His plan was to make it look as if his mother and her friend had gone away on a trip together, buying him time. He hoped to use this time to commit suicide, but when the moment came, he found he couldn't do it. With the bodies of his mother and her best friend in the house, the man who had sustained himself on rage found himself adrift in an empty void. The central organizing principle of his life, his hatred for his mother, was gone. For years, all his emotions had been silenced, and now he was lost in his own internal silence. After several days, he packed a bag, got in his car, and just started driving east. He crossed state lines, aimless. Finally, in a motel room in Pueblo, Colorado, he reached his own conclusion. On April 24th, 1973, he found a payphone, dialed the police, and made one of the most chilling and detailed confessions in the history of crime. "I'm Ed Kemper," he told the disbelieving dispatcher. "I killed my mother and her friend. And I killed those co-eds." Calmly, methodically, and with perfect recall, he listed his crimes, providing details only the killer could know. The monster had, by his own hand, surrendered. Ed Kemper was arrested and extradited back to California. In the courtroom, his demeanor was just as unsettling as it had been on the phone. He was calm, articulate, and seemingly detached, as if narrating someone else's life story. But the story he told was one of pure horror. He showed no emotion. As he described his crimes in graphic detail, "If you're going to sentence me," he told the court, "I feel I should be killed. What I did was an atrocity, and I did it. It was inhuman." For the first time, He seemed to acknowledge his own darkness, to look into the abyss of his own soul. Psychiatrists examined him, confirming his genius-level IQ, but also diagnosing him with paranoid schizophrenia and narcissistic personality disorder. His defense team argued that he was legally insane, but the jury, after hearing his lucid and self-aware testimony, believed otherwise. They concluded that Ed Kemper knew exactly what he was doing. He had killed deliberately, with planning and with full awareness. In 1973, he was found guilty of 8 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, as California had temporarily suspended the death penalty at the time, a fate he ironically protested, insisting he deserved to be executed. Ed Kemper is still alive today, serving his life sentence in a California state prison. The story, in a sense, is not over. But his case leaves us with profound and unsettling questions. Who was the ultimate culprit? Was it Ed, a man born with a flawed mind? Was it his mother, whose years of abuse cultivated the monster within him? Or was it the system which diagnosed him, declared him cured, and released him back into the world without adequate follow-up? And what of the young women, guilty of nothing more than trusting a friendly face? What did they deserve? We have watched the dark history of a monster unfold. But now, the answers to these questions are yours to contemplate.